Good afternoon. Welcome to another ISR lecture. I'm Byron Johnson. I direct the Institute for Studies of Religion. And I'm not going to introduce our speaker. I'm going to introduce the person who's going to introduce our speaker. But I do want to say about Chris Ellison. Chris is, as all of you know in this room, a major figure in multiple disciplines. And it's a shame we haven't had him here before now. So, Chris, we apologize for not getting you up here. We've known each other for many, many years. We have met and had lunch in Salado, but we haven't done the right thing, which is to get him here to give us a lecture. And we will make sure that we do it on a regular basis in the future. But to introduce Chris is Jeff Levin, who's at the Institute for Studies of Religion, and he heads up our program on religion and population health, and has known Chris probably longer than I have. So let me introduce Jeff Levin to introduce Chris.
Thank you, Byron. I'm very happy and honored and privileged to introduce my friend Chris Ellison. We were just talking earlier. How long have we known each other? I think we've known each other since the late 80s, so almost 25 years. But what's funny is we really should have known each other about 35 years, because I only found out after the fact, after knowing him for a while, that we were undergraduates at Duke University in the late 70s at exactly the same time, and we're both majoring in religion, and so we're in the same department, walking the same halls at exactly the same time, and I managed to somehow never meet Chris until, I think, 1989. So a little bit longer than you've known Chris.
Okay, I never went to class.
Well, now I'll share some of his bio. This, by the way, is the short version. Dr. Christopher G. Ellison is Professor of Sociology and Dean's Distinguished Professor of Social Science at the University of Texas at San Antonio. He received his A.B. in Religion and his Ph.D. in Sociology, both from Duke. And prior to coming to UTSA, he taught at UT in Austin for 19 years, where he held an endowed chair. Professor Ellison's research has centered on four things, really: the role of religion in mental and physical health and mortality risk, religious differences in family life and marital relationships and child rearing and discipline, religious institutions and practices and values among racial and ethnic minority populations in the U.S., and public opinions and attitudes about race and ethnicity also in the U.S. Professor Ellison has published over 160 peer-reviewed articles and chapters, along with 2 books. And what's interesting to me when you survey, I've been reading Chris's stuff since the 1980s. He is published in the leading journals in sociology, gerontology, public health, religious studies, family studies, population studies, poli-sci, and other fields I'm probably leaving out. He is a true polymath. Chris was also edited, along with Dr. Bob Hummer at UT, a book entitled Religion, Families, and Health, Population-Based Research in the U.S., which was published by Rutgers in 2010. In 2004, Professor Ellison was selected as a highly cited author by ISI, the Institute for Scientific Information, and he is presently deputy editor of Sociology Religion, and he serves on the editorial boards of numerous journals: Social Forces, Social Science Research, JSSR, Society and Mental Health, and Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy. His research has been funded by various branches of the NIH, including National Institute on Aging, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, as well as from the NSF and the Lilly Endowment and Meta-Nexus Institute and other foundations as well. Dr. Ellison will speak to us today on the topic of Does Faith Really Matter? Exploring the relationships between religion and mental health. Chris, all yours.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's a real pleasure to be here. You can all go home now, because I don't have anything to say that's going to come even remotely close to that. But a tremendous pleasure to be here. I'm so impressed with all the terrific work that's being done at Baylor and at the Institute in particular. And it's a real pleasure to be at a place where you can talk about research on religion and everybody's so responsive and interested and engaged. Don't take that for granted. That's not true everywhere by a long shot. And so it's really been a pleasure to be here over the last day or so, and to talk with so many of you. And I appreciate your coming very much today. This talk is about something that I've been interested in since my days in graduate school. I had the good fortune to go to school at Duke, which was really ground zero for the study of religion and health in many ways, dating back to the 1980s. And data were being collected there, people were excited about it, and many people around the country thought they were just nuts. In fact, they thought Jeff was just nuts, if I may say so. Jeff is well aware of that. They thought I was just nuts. And that field has grown and grown and grown, and some people still think we're nuts, but the numbers have dwindled over time, as it really does seem to be now more and more evident that faith does matter for mental health. So I've already answered the question. So if you want to leave, you can leave. But over the next little while, I'd like to tell you a bit about what the research literature shows and why faith matters, how it matters, and show you some evidence that I hope will be suggestive to you, as suggestive as we can be in one talk, and then say a bit about where I think the research in this field should go over the next several years. So. By way of brief background, as I just mentioned, there's this growing body of empirical work primarily using survey data that links religiousness and mental health, conceptualizes and measures religiousness in a lot of different ways. This really began in the 1980s in earnest, although there's been a long tradition of theoretical work in psychology and sociology and other disciplines that goes back a century. At least, and of course in theology, far beyond that. A lot of the work at this point is rooted in several academic disciplines. Certainly sociology has a contribution to make. Psychology has been very important. Psychiatry, social work, public health, nursing have been among the leading contributors as well. So this has really been a combined effort of researchers across a number of different academic fields and disciplines who have worked together, sometimes fought, sometimes argued, but have often come to some shared conclusions, at least broadly speaking. Most of the studies in this tradition seem to point to some salutary relationship between religiousness and mental health. That's the weight of the evidence, I think it's fair to say. It's not a unanimous verdict, and there are certain ways in which religiousness and spirituality, it seems, may take a toll on individuals and their mental health. And I want to talk about both of those because I believe it's really important to give a balanced account of this association. So we'll come to that presently. The goals, at least as I conceive of them, I want to focus on several strands of research on this topic. I want to focus primarily on the U.S. and the developed West. This is where a lot of the work has been conducted. The U.S. has been a particular site. It's not the only site. Increasingly, we're getting really good quality research from a range of other countries, not all of which are Judeo-Christian. We have a growing body of work on Islamic societies. We have a growing body of work in other places. It's still small, but I'm happy to say it's growing, and that I think is really important. But I want to focus today primarily on the U.S. and a handful of other developed Western societies. I want to focus, as a sociologist, primarily on community-based studies. This is not primarily an introduction to clinical research. There's also a separate body of research using clinical samples, that is, samples of patients in various states of infirmity, looking at the role of religion and spirituality in helping them cope with these problems. In many respects, this comes close to sampling, for me, comes close to sampling on the dependent variable. You select people who have problems, and then you see how they fare. That's an important strand of work. It's not what I'm going to be talking about today. Finally, mental health itself is a huge territory. So many things can be meant by mental health. I have to be a little bit more restrictive in one talk than some people might want. I want to focus on several outcomes. One is what we refer to as subjective well-being. Among the outcomes under this rubric are things like life satisfaction and happiness. Also, symptoms of depression, anxiety, psychological distress, which is something that sociologists talk a lot about. It's a composite of anxiety, depression, and something called somatization, or the translation of mental health problems into physical symptoms. Affective disorders, quad disorders, that is, conditions that meet clinical standards for major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and so forth, and a few other mental health outcomes that I'll throw in along the way. This excludes a number of things: schizophrenia, for example, a whole host of personality disorders, and so forth. Just can't cover that here. What do we mean when we say religion? From a social science standpoint, this is going to be totally unsatisfactory for theologians, scholars of religious studies, and perhaps others as well. But you have to draw some boundaries around this as well in order to get through a lecture of this kind. One way that religion has been, and religiousness has been considered in this literature is through literature on religious orientations. What are the motivations or orientations that people bring to religiousness? This has been a very popular topic in psychology, dating back at least to the work of Gordon Allport in the 1940s and 1950s, who distinguished between intrinsically motivated people and extrinsically motivated people. Intrinsic meaning people who attempt to carry forth their faith in all areas of their lives. They're very devoted to their faith for that reason. Extrinsically motivated people are people who engage in religious practice and adopt religious affiliations for reasons that are not intrinsic. They're using religion as a means to achieve some other end, whether it's alleviation of pain, physical or emotional, whether it's social ties, whatever it might be. More recently, people have talked about the quest orientation, which is a much more open-ended religious or spiritual orientation. Questers are people who really want to learn about faith. They want to explore what the whole domain of religion and spirituality might have to offer them. They're not necessarily dogmatically committed or doctrinally committed, and they're quite open to changing their beliefs if they find something that's more appealing to them. I'm not going to talk as much about orientations and the link with mental health. That's really not so much what sociologists are interested in, but I want to make sure that people are aware that this is an important tradition in this broader literature. Religious affiliations and practices. Now, as a sociologist, this is sort of our bread and butter. We're interested in group differences. We're interested in religious practices, things like religious attendance, non-organizational practices like prayer and devotional participation and things like that, things that are often measured in surveys of the kind that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. The functions of religion and spirituality for individuals is another way that investigators have come to think about the role of religion. Here we might think about the role of congregational support systems. We might think about religious coping strategies and styles. This is important, particularly for work on health, and it's become really a growth industry in this entire area. Finally, beliefs and experiences. For a long time, people who studied religion and health, mental health or physical health, really didn't pay much attention to belief. Kind of odd. What is religion without belief? An area that generated a lot of research for a long time because we really didn't do much with particular doctrines, with particular beliefs. And there was a real concern on the part of people who helped the field develop that we didn't really want to talk about particular groups and dangerously conclude that perhaps Baptists had better mental health than Catholics. That would be bad. People who believed in eternal life might have better mental health than other people. Dangerous stuff. We're more open to that now that the field has become a little more established. So religious beliefs and experiences are increasingly significant in this area. So what do we know about affiliations and practices? When it comes to denominations and group differences, frankly, not much. There hasn't been a tremendous body of work on this, and what we do know is very internally inconsistent. There are some studies, for example, that do look at Pentecostals and Charismatics. Some of that literature suggests that they're particularly prone to anxiety disorders. Okay, that's kind of interesting. We're not sure what to make of that, but that's a finding that Harold Koenig, one of the preeminent researchers in the area, put forth in several studies a few years ago. On the other hand, conservative Protestants, evangelicals, tend to be more satisfied with life, according to some studies. Interesting. Other than that, we're coming up kind of empty on the group differences denominations part of this. Organizational participation, by which we might mean attendance at religious services, activity in a religious congregation. Now, this is much more consistent. We really know much more about this. At least we have a far more consistent body of evidence. Many studies, I would say hundreds to be safe, have looked at the association between religious attendance and a range of mental health outcomes. The overwhelming majority of studies show what seems to be a salutary association. More attendance, better mental health. Pretty simple. There are a few studies that don't show this. There are a few studies you can find out there that show curvilinear association. And the nature of the curvilinear association varies. But the main pattern is a linear pattern. More attendance and more congregational participation, better mental health. Why might this be the case? Well, people have put forth a number of explanations. First of all, attendance at services may strengthen one's belief system. It offers opportunities for social participation, social solidarity, ritual participation. It particularly contributes to social solidarity, according to some theorists. Access to social resources, congregational support networks, maybe even social services that are distributed by religious congregations can be helpful. The worship service itself may contribute to a release of negative emotions, particularly the more jubilant or charismatic worship experiences. There's another explanation, too, that some people are attracted to and hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, in my own humble opinion. That is the idea that people who attend services more often lead lifestyles that reduce their level of stress. They just don't get exposed to as much bad stuff. Now, everybody has the loss of a loved one. That's inevitable. There's certain things you can't avoid. You still have to pay your taxes on April 15th if you don't file an extension. But other than that, if you lead a good, sober lifestyle, you probably overall have a lower risk of chronic disease. If you conduct yourself ethically in business and interpersonal relationships, you're probably going to have fewer interpersonal conflicts, and you won't get in trouble with the law. You won't meet as many lawyers. That'll be good. The other sort of thing is we see connections with family life, and people who attend services more often, particularly if they do so as a family, are likely to have better marital and relationship quality, closer connections across generations, and so forth. This may also be part of the explanation that we see. Non-organizational participation, what does that mean? Frequency of prayer is the dimension here that people talk about most often. Everyone's very interested in prayer. And the thing that's mentioned in surveys most often is, how often do you pray? It's a terrible question. Means almost nothing, but it's one of those things that's easy to ask in a survey, and you think people can answer it accurately. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. They don't seem to be able to answer questions about frequency of attendance very accurately. We're learning more and more about that. So those responses sometimes are a bit biased in the upward direction. Studies have increasingly shown that. It's very hard to evaluate the accuracy of questions about frequency of prayer because we can't really tell what people do when they pray. But one of the things that is kind of odd is frequency of prayer has a very inconsistent association with most mental health outcomes. Some studies show that it seems to be very beneficial. Other studies show that it seems to be associated with worse outcomes. Maybe that's because people in trouble pray more often. Maybe it has a curvilinear association. Well, you can find evidence for any one of these different positions if you look hard enough in the research literature. I tell you, my interest increasingly is not in how often people pray, but in the way that association between frequency of prayer and mental health is moderated by or is contingent on other things about the prayer experience. One of those is the type of prayer. Researchers have identified a number of different types of prayer or modes of prayer, things people do when they pray. For example, some people pray for stuff. They pray for things they need or things they want to happen. It's petitionary prayer. Some studies show those people don't do nearly as well as other people. Other people engage in a more meditative form of prayer where their primary interest is in cultivating an ongoing and ever-deepening association with God. Those people seem to do better. So the mode of prayer seems to make a difference. Another thing people talk about is prayer expectancies. If you're praying for stuff, it matters what you expect to happen. Who's best in position, for example, to decide what constitutes an answer to a prayer? Do you get to decide that, or do you give that over to God? That seems to make a difference. What's the timeline for that? Do you get to decide that? You answer by 3. I've got an appointment, or does God get to decide that? And apparently, at least one study that's come out fairly recently, it's the people who have an open time frame and believe that God is the one who decides all these things. That people who pray don't get to decide what constitutes an answer to a prayer or the deadline by which it ought to be answered in order to qualify. It's those people who give it over to God who fare best. Images of God. What is it you're praying to? Are you praying to a God that's loving and forgiving? Is that the primary characteristic? You're praying to a God that's primarily punitive and harsh? That makes a difference. Finally, one's relationship to God. Do you feel close to God? Do you have a secure, intimate relationship with God? Do you have an insecure relationship with God? Do you have an anxious relationship with God? Psychologists refer to this as attachment. Is God, you can really count on God? You feel that God is there and helps you with the things that you need and is available for solace and guidance and comfort? Or is God sometimes there? Not so much. Can't really tell. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That makes a difference. In fact, this is a graph from a paper that actually was conducted using data from the most recent Baylor Religion Survey, which is currently in the review process. The outcome, which is along the side here, the Y side, is symptoms of general anxiety disorder. Across the bottom is a zero-centered measure of frequency of prayer. And these lines show you how much difference it makes, the degree to which the individual who's praying has a secure versus an insecure relationship with God. Begin by looking at the line in the middle, the one with the little tiny dots going across. That's the association between prayer and general anxiety at the mean level of secure attachment. Isn't that an impressive association? It is absolutely flat. There is no association. But if you begin to look at people who, in the extreme, are two standard deviations above the mean on secure attachment. These are people who really feel God is there for them. They have a very close relationship with God. They really feel they can count on God. Look at the association between frequency of prayer and general anxiety. It's very strong. More prayer, you're doing great. Even here, when we see one standard deviation above the mean on secure attachment, prayer has some definite benefits. On the other hand, if you're one standard deviation, and certainly if you're two standard deviations below the mean on secure attachment, things aren't going very well, and more prayer is not helping. I told you I'd throw in some graphs to make this slightly less boring. Doing my best here. All right. Religious functions. Having dispensed a bit with group affiliations and practices. Religious functions. The first one worth considering is congregational support. There are two ways to think about this, and people, even professional sociologists, I think, get this really wrong and equate the two in research process, and it's not a good thing. It's possible for religious involvement to contribute to a higher level of social resources, so that religious people, or frequent religious attenders, or what have you, have a higher level of social support, regardless of where it comes from. They have more friends, they see those friends more often, their friends are more helpful to them, give them more different kinds of support if they need it, so on. And that in turn contributes to well-being or reduces the risk of mental health problems. Fair enough. Now, this is an easy thing to explore in a lot of studies because they don't ask questions, and this is the theme we'll come back to again and again and again. They don't ask questions about congregational support. They ask questions about how much social support do you have. This is common in a lot of databases that are focused on health. They're interested in how much you have. They don't really care where it comes from. It can come from your neighbor, it can come from coworkers, doesn't matter. Now, despite that, we find that people who attend religious services frequently tend to have higher levels of social support, even by these very, very crude measures. There's something interesting going on there. But a second way to think about this is really to ask the question directly about the relationships in your congregation. And there's some studies that have just done a masterful job of this. One person who's has led the field in this for several years now is Neil Krauss at the University of Michigan. He's really the shining light in this particular area. This is a different sort of a thing. By measuring congregational support directly, you actually sort of cut out the middleman here, and often the relationships with mental health outcomes are stronger when you do it that way than when you do it the first way that I described. But what do we mean when we say congregational support? Well, lots of things. There's no one thing that constitutes social support. Think of all the ways people can help each other and do good things for each other. One of those is instrumental or tangible aid, stuff you can feel, stuff you can actually use. This can be informal. It can occur among people who are in the congregation. That's one way. It can also be formal. It can refer to the access of resources in the congregation that are programs, maybe clergy assistance would constitute formal help. Ministries of one kind or another. This can include goods and services that people will exchange among themselves or get from congregational ministries. It can include information. Congregations can be important sources of information. One of the most important things for mental health, however, is not the tangible aid so much as the socio-emotional assistance. The ability of people in the congregation to make you feel loved, valued, cared for, to make you feel like you matter. and health sociologists care a lot about this variable mattering. Do you really matter to people? Or you feel that you matter to people. Actually, you may not matter to people, but if you think you do, you're doing pretty well. So socio-emotional assistance is really fairly closely tied to mental health, and congregations seem to be an important source of that, particularly important for certain groups. Another thing is spiritual support. Now, notice that instrumental or tangible aid is a kind of help you could get from other places besides the church. You can get it from other people. You can get it from family members. You can get it from your neighborhood group. You can get it from social service agencies, so on and so forth. Socio-emotional assistance, the same thing. But spiritual support, where do you get that? And what is it? Spiritual support really refers in this context to information, advice, guidance that helps you live out the tenets of your faith more consistently, to apply principles of your faith to your life. You can't get that at the Garden Club. Probably. I don't know where you live, but I'm guessing probably not. And this, too, has a bearing on mental health and psychological well-being. Another thing that's really important about this that bears directly on congregations is it's important to think about getting stuff. But there's a literature that shows that people who get stuff all the time but don't give stuff don't do nearly as well as people who are involved in ongoing networks. And this is one of those things that congregations do for people. They put them in ongoing networks. You don't feel necessarily dependent all the time if you're part of one of these networks, because you can draw on assistance when you need it, but you can also give assistance. And that makes people feel powerful. It makes them feel they matter. It makes them feel they have a sense of mastery or a sense of control. This is also extremely good for people. That's a very important thing about this. That's true in informal exchange networks, but it's also the case that religious groups offer opportunities to volunteer, to do good works in the community, to help people who are less fortunate, and that's a very powerful thing for people. And you don't necessarily have to be wealthy or well-educated or anything to give your time to a worthwhile cause that begins in your religious congregation. So, one of the things that's kind of interesting about the way religious support networks have been studied is this research tends to show that people who are in religious settings tend to perceive, maybe they're wrong, but they perceive their support networks to be of greater quality and to be more reliable than people who have support from other sources. Now, they could be cruising for a bruising. They could be totally wrong, and when they draw on that support, who knows? Perhaps it won't be there. But these communities convey a very strong sense that that support can be counted on, that it's rock solid, and that if they need help, someone will be there to deliver it. And that sense that support is reliable is extremely important in shaping well-being in several studies. So that's one thing that's worth mentioning here. One thing people don't really talk about when they talk about religion and social support is the importance of family ties. And I just mentioned also that religious involvement is connected with marital quality, relationship quality, and intergenerational ties. And that's true of relationships between parents and children and adolescents, but also bonds between parents and adult children as well. This doesn't go away when children grow into adults. And there are a number of studies that speak pretty eloquently to that. Another kind of religious function that's very significant here is the role of religious coping with stress, dealing with personal problems. Do people really do that kind of stuff? Yeah, they do. Especially certain segments of the population turn to prayer, turn to religion for strength and comfort. They turn to pastoral care for counseling and assistance. And actually, mental health problems are among the type of problems that most commonly lead people to consult with clergy. And there's a study that's sort of a good news, bad news study that came out just a few years ago using the National Comorbidity Replication data that showed just a surprising percentage of people who went to the clergy with mental health problems, and the problems were the most severe form of mental health problems. It's not that they went to them for the small stuff, and then they consulted professional assistance for the really serious stuff. If anything, it was sort of the opposite. And in many cases, what struck me was a relatively high percentage of cases, they didn't ever make it beyond the clergy. It's not like they started with the clergy and went to somebody else later. They went to the clergy and that was it. And they talked to the clergy a few times and that was it, suggesting it's pretty important for the clergy to be on top of developments in the mental health field, because whether they signed on for it or not, they are frontline mental health workers. And some of this has to do with socioeconomic status and the culture of the community and perhaps distrust of secular mental health professionals. Some of it, there are all kinds of other reasons that one might think of, but this is an extremely important angle as well. Some of this varies by the kind of stressor or the kind of negative event or crisis that people may be confronting. Some people have suggested people go to the clergy for family problems. Actually, empirically, it doesn't seem to be the case necessarily. Some studies suggest that. Other studies suggest that family problems are probably the least likely problems for which people go to the clergy, because there are strong norms about what a proper family is supposed to be. Nobody wants to suggest to the clergy member that their family isn't living up to the Christian model or what have you. But physical health, mental health problems are very likely to elicit religious coping, whether it's of a formal sort or whether it's personal prayer and so forth. Also, bereavement, loss of a loved one, is also very likely to elicit religious coping. And the extent to which religion is in people's cultural repertoire is very important. There is this old saying out there: there are no atheists in foxholes. Yes, there are. I mean, really, empirically, there are. If you didn't believe in God before, you may say, "Oh God," but you're not cultivating a deep faith at that particular point. The people who really turn to faith and draw on religion in times of trouble are the people who have religion in their background. They're the people who draw on it in other settings. They practice and so forth. They're much more likely to turn to prayer than others. There's a fascinating literature by a psychologist named Ken Pargament and a team of thousands of colleagues, graduate students, and many, many others. I don't know where he finds all these people, but they're all good apparently. And what he has done is uncover incredible diversity of ways in which people draw on faith in times of trouble. And it's not that they do it. They do it in so many different ways, at so many different stages in the coping process. His work just stands alone in what he's been able to demonstrate. But there are three types that are kind of I think particularly interesting for the study of mental health. One is in the process of assessing what the stressful event or condition is, what it means, its meaning for the individual, and so forth. The appraisal process is one place where religion seems to play a particularly important role. Ken Pargament talks about benevolent reappraisal. That is, the ability of individuals to invoke religious insights and draw on religious imagery and understandings to reinterpret stressful events as not necessarily good things, although that sometimes happens, but as less threatening to the individual, to the sense of self. Potentially less problematic than they might otherwise have been. Maybe they're bad things in one sense, but they're opportunities in another sense. Thinking that they're part of God's plan might not be entirely an unhelpful thing for people of deep faith. And there are a number of other examples of this. He also talks about a process that he calls collaborative religious coping. The sense that individuals go into a problem and feel that they are part of a divine dynamic partnership, that they're not trying to resolve this alone, that whatever happens, God's with them, that they're talking to God, interacting with God, engaging with their faith, and they're working together to solve this. This burden doesn't fall on their shoulders alone. And there's plenty of evidence to show that people who engage in this style of coping in particular fare much better in mental health and physical health than others. And of course, those who seek spiritual support from those in their congregation fare better as well, according to his work. Other ways in which religion is linked with mental health, we could think of a sense of meaning and purpose in life. This is certainly one thing that religion provides. People can have a sense of meaning and purpose in life. Religion is certainly one place that can provide that. Strength and comfort. One of the things that a scholar named Scott Sheeman talks a lot about, and we have some fascinating work on that, is notion of divine control. It matters, particularly for certain groups in the population, whether people feel that God is actively involved in their lives, is a ready presence there, is giving them opportunities, is almost taking them by the hand, not literally, but certainly figuratively, as they go through their lives and they make decisions. This sense of divine control is connected with well-being for certain groups, not for everybody. I'll show you a slide about that in just a couple of minutes. Forgiveness is one area that's received a tremendous amount of research over the last 5 to 10 years. One of the findings from some work that Neil Krauss and I did is that forgiveness by God really is a critical impetus to forgiveness for a lot of people. People forgive for all kinds of different reasons. People are more likely to forgive others if they're forgiven by God. The best kind of forgiveness probably won't surprise you. It's unconditional forgiveness. There's a big difference in mental health and to a certain extent in physical health for people who say, you know what, I'm just going to let bygones be bygones. Never mind. Let's just forget about it. It's not a big deal. Versus people who goes, well, I'll forgive you, but we need to talk. First you need to repent. Then it'd be great if I could get a free steak out of this. And you got to promise not to do it again. And then I'm going to remind you about it a few times just to make sure this lesson took. And, those are people who don't fare nearly as well. This unconditional forgiveness seems to help people release anger and negative emotions connected with whatever the initial triggering episode was. The latest body of research is increasingly focused on other virtues, things like gratitude, other character strengths, individuals who feel a sense of gratitude to the world, but particularly gratitude toward God, which is where a lot of this research is focused, really are less inclined toward depression, less inclined toward anxiety, other mental health problems. Religious beliefs and experiences. Do beliefs matter? Have we just been wrong in ignoring this the whole time? Yes. Well, actually, yes to both. Yes, they matter, and yes, we've been wrong to ignore them all this time. Does it matter whether you believe in an afterlife? Yes. A lot of times this question is simply posed as a yes-no, or you can have yes, no, and undecided. And about 2/3 of the U.S. public says they believe in an afterlife, and the rest are roughly evenly divided between no and undecided. And then there are people who claim that it's the undecided people who are worse off. But the people who either really believe or really don't believe, well, they're just about the same. I don't know what data they're looking at, but I can't find any evidence of that. The people who believe tend to have lower depression, lower anxiety, and score better on a lot of other mental health outcomes. That's not a comment on whether there is one. I have to keep my social science credentials intact. But believers tend to fare much better. And I'll show you, they not only fare better overall, but they particularly fare better under certain stressful conditions or problematic conditions. In addition to simply believing, we actually stumbled on some data that enabled us to look at specific beliefs about the afterlife. Not everybody believes the same thing about the afterlife. Different religious traditions teach different things about the afterlife. Individuals have all kinds of different beliefs. Shirley MacLaine thinks you're going to be reincarnated and come back as a toaster or something. I don't know. All kinds of people have different beliefs. Some of them are really associated with desirable outcomes. Some of them are associated with very negative outcomes. Unfortunately, these data are cross-sectional. That is, they're like a snapshot. So it's impossible to establish cause and effect. But people who believe in reincarnation, well, I don't think they don't seem to be very happy. They're at higher risk of depression, anxiety, a host of other mental health problems. People whose idea of an afterlife, on the other hand, is a loving union with God, and that's what they're expecting when they pass from this earth. Well, that's at the other end of the spectrum. Those are people who are significantly advantaged with respect to the psychiatric symptoms of various kinds. And this goes beyond depression and anxiety. We've got data on symptoms of paranoia, hostility, phobia, several other things that are validated standard symptom measures from what's called the SA-45. Worst of all is belief in an afterlife is a pale, shadowy existence, almost no existence at all. If that's what you believe, just try to convince yourself there's not an afterlife. You're actually better off. Images of God. Do images of God really matter? Seems so. People whose image of God is loving and forgiving do tend to fare better on many of these outcome measures than those whose image of God is wrathful, angered by sin, punitive, and so forth. Beliefs about human nature. This has a long history in psychology, especially dating back to, well, in contemporary times, never mind dating back to, in contemporary times, Albert Ellis is the person who's really, for many years, was on the bandwagon about the problems associated with the doctrine of original sin. He said, this was either the cause of or an expression of virtually every neurotic disturbance that he had seen in his clinical practice. He's a devout atheist who passed away in 2007, and he was the founder of something called rational emotive therapy. He was kind of a follower also of Ayn Rand and objectivist philosophy. So we were kind of interested. Does the belief that human nature is fundamentally sinful, is it really connected with mental health? Well, we've found a few data sets that have that kind of information, not a lot. People don't want to talk about human nature for some reason. I don't know why, but it's not asked very often. But it is associated with things like a lower sense of personal efficacy. It's associated with a few other negative outcomes, slightly higher rates lower rates rather of life satisfaction, a few other things that would seem to suggest that there's a problematic dimension to this. Certainly well worth exploring in more detail. And one of the things that we were able to find where we did have psychiatric symptoms, it's associated with more depression, more anxiety, and so forth, in this one database that we were able to find. That's all we could do. But its effects, negative as they are completely counterbalanced by the belief that the individual is forgiven by God. So, I guess score one for Orthodox Christian doctrine as best I can tell. I mentioned earlier the nature of one's relationship with or attachment to God, this distinction between secure versus insecure, and this other type of attachment that we call anxious seems to loom large in a number of studies. People have also talked about what are called daily spiritual experiences, and there's a small number of people who really think this is the key to understanding religiousness and spirituality and mental health. I've looked at this a little bit, and I can't find a whole lot of evidence of this. There's a theistic dimension to this and a non-theistic dimension to this. Non-theistic includes, I kid you not, walking in the woods. It seems to be associated with good outcomes. They're good things, and they tend to be associated with desirable outcomes like life satisfaction and self-esteem. They don't seem to be associated with negative outcomes, which are the ones we might want to try to forestall. So more work really needs to be done to see whether there's really something there or not. I mentioned spiritual struggles, the bad stuff. Does religion really have a dark side? Are there really some ways that religiousness and spirituality can undermine mental health? So it seems. The three that people talk about the most, this isn't an exclusive list by any means, are divine struggles, intrapsychic struggles, and interpersonal struggles. And I'll just say a few things about these because I know I'm running a little bit long. Divine struggles, now, and I should also say before I start that these are not the modal ways in which individuals experience or encounter religion. In other words, a proportion of the population who would get high scores on any of these is not very large. When they occur, they're associated with bad stuff. They're red flags that should go up for everybody. But many more people encounter desirable sorts of effects associated with religion and spirituality than encounter these. But the effect sizes, for those of you who are social or behavioral scientists, the effect sizes are really pretty impressive and unpleasant. Divine struggles, this really refers to people with a troubled relationship with God who feel that perhaps God has abandoned them. They're angry with God because of something that they perceive God has done in their life or done to a loved one. They're even so frustrated they don't understand how God could let something like this happen that they've come to wonder about God's existence in the first place. How could God let this happen? Intrapsychic struggles refers to chronic religious doubting. This really is exemplified as the problem of evil in the world affairs, like famines or wars or horrible things that happen globally, bad things that happen in your life, scientific developments, or things like that cause you to doubt your faith, and you can't seem to get those doubts resolved. Because I suspect that everybody doubts at one point or another. But these are doubts that seem to be chronic. They don't seem to be resolved. They linger. For the most part, spiritual struggles are associated in the same way with mental health outcomes across virtually every segment of the population. This is the one area where that's not true. There's a consistent, across databases and samples and so forth, there's a consistent variation across age. Younger people have higher levels of chronic doubt, and that pattern declines monotonically as people age. Okay? And younger people also bear a greater hardship as a result of chronic doubting. And the quantity of if you want to think of it that way, of chronic doubting declines with age, and the magnitude of the effect, the degree of harm that chronic doubting does, also declines with age. So, finally, interpersonal struggles. We all know that people are nice. They're just cherubs in religious settings, aren't they? Nobody in churches fights. Everybody agrees about everything. And don't worry, I haven't inhaled in years, I promise. Of course, there's negative interactions within religious settings, conflicts within congregations. The sources of these can range from political issues, things that people disagree with about matters of politics, theological issues, congregational administration or policy, or should we fire the pastor or not? Things like that. If we fire the pastor, are you going to stay in this church? You're going to go with the pastor. So some more severe matters. One of the ways that this is measured in a number of studies is really the combination of too many demands placed on the individual by the congregation and too little privacy for the individual as a result of congregational policies or the experiences of people within the congregation. They experience the congregation as being demanding and intrusive. And that's one common way that negative interactions is thought about. But it's certainly not the only one, and the examples I've given aren't exhaustive either. All of these things are associated with elevated rates of depression, distress, anxiety, not only cross-sectionally but also longitudinally in several different databases. Some of them are nationwide. Some of them are specific to a particular denomination that I've done a lot of work with. That's actually the Presbyterian Church USA. They have a great research office, and they're very interested in these issues. Subgroup variations in the links between religion and mental health. I mentioned one. It's this patterning by age and the association between doubt and mental health. That's not the only one. One of the big things in this literature is to see the interaction, the contingent relationship between religion and mental health, contingent on stress. Is religion good for everybody equally? If indeed it's good for people, as I've sort of suggested that in many ways it probably is. Or is it more beneficial for people who are facing a high level of stress? And we typically think of stress in terms of events or conditions that are experienced quite negatively by the individual, that probably elicit physiological reactivity and so forth. We don't really measure that directly in most of our studies. We look at the number of social stressors or chronic or acute stressful circumstances. So we talk about two different kinds. One, this is called a moderator effect, and one way to think about this is as a stress buffering effect. Does religion buffer the harmful effect of stress on mental health? Does it weaken it, mitigate it, make it less severe, less harmful? Or does it exacerbate it? Do certain kinds of religion, certain ways that religion is experienced, like spiritual struggles, actually exacerbate the effect of stress, so that not only do you get the effect of stress, which you already know is bad, but you've got a multiplier effect going on there that is really the effect of spiritual struggles, which actually act as another one or two or three stressors on top of the original stressors. Well, some of this has to do with level of stress. That's one way that people have studied this. I'll show you a slide in a minute. Another is people have focused on a particular kind of stressor. Maybe the answer depends on, this broad question depends on what kind of stressor is really in play. Some people have suggested that religion buffers the effects of certain kinds of stressors but exacerbates the effects of others. Maybe it buffers the effects of, physical health problems or other types of stressors, but it exacerbates the effect of family stressors because there's certain family norms that are not being upheld when you have stressful events and conditions. So that's one possibility. Also, people have studied differential associations by race and ethnicity. There's a ton of evidence out there that seems to suggest that where race and ethnicity moderate the link between religiousness and mental health, that almost always African Americans benefit more. This is very consistent with a theme in Neil Krause's work. I mentioned him earlier, and particularly with respect to indicators of congregational life, congregational support, and so forth. And finally, differential associations by socioeconomic status. There seems to be an educational gradient in the link between religiousness and mental health. The association is strongest for people with low levels of education, and it diminishes pretty consistently across educational levels. It's weakest for people with advanced degrees. If you're interested, stop now, go home. There is still a benefit, though, so I should say that, even at high levels of education. And also economic resources. Stress and insecure attachment. Here is an example just from the Presbyterian Church USA. It is a denominational sample. It's longitudinal. So this is the effect of the number of stressful life events on essentially changes in psychological distress. We've adjusted for time 1 psychological distress, so we're really looking at changes in psychological distress across waves. And we're trying to see whether secure attachment to God actually moderates this. And indeed it does. For people who are 2 standard deviations, well, let's start with the mean. The mean is this little dotted line, as usual. And you see stress is bad. No big news there. More stressful events you have, the more distress you feel. Okay? But for people who are very high on secure attachment, it's probably not a significant association, but it's just about a flat line. It even goes down a little bit. That's how powerful secure attachment to God is for people who are scoring high on stressful life events. Big gap here, people who are 1 standard deviation above the mean on secure attachment, still getting a little bit of pain from stressful life events, but not nearly like the other groups. On the other hand, 2 standard deviations below the mean, even below the mean on secure attachment, more stressful life events are just disastrous. You get the same thing with anxious attachment to God, the same kind of a pattern, only in reverse. Here's some material from a study that I published with a former student of mine, Matt Bradshaw, in 2010. This uses actually data from the North General Social Survey, a special module there. And we're looking at religious attendance and objective financial hardship, which is basically an income measure. It sounds better when you say objective financial hardship, doesn't it? I like that better. And here you are with religious attendance basically buffering the effect of objective financial hardship. And very quickly, belief in an afterlife. Does it matter? Well, you be the judge. If you believe your income, this is a subjective measure of financial hardship. If you believe your income is average or above, doesn't really matter very much. On the other hand, if you experience your income as below average or much below average, here are the people who believe in an afterlife, and here are the people who don't believe. The people who believe aren't much different in their level of psychological distress from the people whose income is average or above. On the other hand, the people who don't believe are in a great deal of psychological pain about that. So, and finally, the last graph, sense of divine control and anxiety by race and socioeconomic status. This is a paper I did with Scott Sheeman and a couple other people several years ago. This is the sense of divine control construct that I mentioned earlier. Connected with anxiety, a measure of symptoms of anxiety. Okay? Divine control actually is a pretty good thing, in some cases a very good thing. It's an extremely good thing in terms of the slope coefficient for this top group up here who are low socioeconomic status African Americans. But it also pays dividends for high SES whites and for high SES African Americans. The big problem is that solid black line. For sense of divine control is associated with much greater anxiety, a much steeper slope for one particular group, and that's low SES whites. And we have a lot to say in the paper about why this could possibly be the case. It's quite counterintuitive at first. This may have something to do with the kind of religion that is embraced and practiced by low SES whites, which may have to do with this punitive image of God, the belief that sinful human nature is being dealt with, and so forth. So the sense of divine control may not be very good, because God may be controlling things in a way that's very negative with respect to the individual. A few things about the road from here, at least my view of the road from here, which is warped like everything else. We need much closer attention to non-Judeo-Christian faiths. Of course, we need more research on everything, but we particularly need more attention to non-Judeo-Christian faiths. In some ways, we have findings that match across a whole array of world traditions. In some cases, there's some very distinctive things that were coming out of East Asia, and so on. We need to focus a bit more attention on that. We really need much better data quality, particularly longitudinal data. It's nice to look at cross-section, but we need longitudinal data, and we need more than 2 waves, because as a legislator from Mississippi apparently once said at a congressional hearing, more education is not a pancreas. Well, longitudinal data with 2 waves, there's no pancreas either. Okay, so 3 waves minimum in order to be able to sort out some causality issues would be extremely helpful. Most of the data sources that we have that are publicly available, if we don't collect them ourselves, they're very constrained in terms of the kinds of measures and questions that they ask about religion. You get religious attendance, which can be biased and is very, very limited in so many ways. Frequency of prayer, what denomination are you? You're actually kind of happy if you get those. These kinds of questions are not high priority for a lot of big nationwide data collection projects. So many of the things that I've shown you are from data that were collected specially by people with a strong interest in the role of religion and spirituality. We're inclined to think mental health is mental health is mental health, and we're inclined to suspect that the connections between aspects of religion and mental health should be consistent across these outcomes. We don't have any theoretical edifice that would allow us to think we should expect to find one thing for life satisfaction, another one for depression, and something else for death anxiety or what have you, just all mental health. We need to get past that. We have not done a very good job in this field of sorting out exactly how this ought to work, and I include myself in that. As a sociologist, I'm deeply invested in context. We treat religion like it's education, that is, it's an attribute of the individual. How many years did you go to school? Okay, fine. With religion, of course it's an attribute of the individual. Individuals believe, individuals practice, individuals do things, experience things. But so do families, so do spouses and partners, so do communities. And we need to do much more to figure out how all of these different dimensions tie together. Because I think probably my guess is, even when we've used richer measures of religion, the power of religion, the connection of religion to mental health suddenly goes up tremendously. Well, it didn't go up. We just started thinking about it and measuring it in a more sophisticated way. My guess is if we start thinking about religion at other levels, we're going to see a much richer set of associations too. And finally, there's the role of potential behavior genetic analysis, which has really come into its own in sociology in the last 5 years. Not much in sociology of religion, where it's still sort of taboo, but not many people take behavior genetic approaches to the study of religion in general. Ken Kindler at Virginia Commonwealth is a notable exception. He's been doing this for years. But this would be a useful thing for us to think about, the role of religion in gene-environment interactions and shaping mental health outcomes. Really hasn't been explored fully. And the use of biomarkers more generally. We talk about stress and we think about stressful life events. We need to really focus much more on biomarkers like things we can measure cheaply was a good place to start. Cortisol, where you can do a cheek swab and you're off to the races. It's much cheaper than a blood array or something like that. Plus, I don't like the sight of blood. I don't know about you, but it's not my thing. Also, neuroimaging and many things that can be done with MRIs and so forth that people are just now starting really to think about with regard to the role of religion. And there's several people doing that kind of work, even a team of researchers at the National Institutes of Health. But it'd be really neat if we can bring these different research communities together. I think we learn a great deal more about the connections between religion and mental health. That'd be very exciting. Thank you for listening. Most of you stayed. I don't know how. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. We have time for a few minutes for some questions, so why don't you go ahead, and Chris, I'll just let you negotiate the questions here.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. You mentioned that belief is one of the understudied areas, and I wonder how much research has been done on belief in diversity or religious tolerance to see how religiousness is associated with tolerance and diversity and that kind of thing.
A good bit, a lot of it's done in psychology. There's a guy back here who knows something about this, Wade Rowett. So from a psychological standpoint, I think there's a fair amount of literature. I think in sociology, not a lot. I mean, it's really unfortunate. There's some particular things about, so for example, racial attitudes toward African Americans, and so forth. A few things about attitudes toward immigrants and things like that. But there's room for a great deal more attention to this particular topic in the sociological community. I think several people have identified group differences there, especially, and there's some political scientists I know also working on that. I'd be glad to give you their names after this if you want. Okay. Yeah. Hey, Kevin. Yeah.
Hello. So, is the supernatural necessary, or are these just markers of something bigger, that really what is driving these positive mental health outcomes is hope? And that one source of hope is these ideas of the divine, but hope could come from other places, and that your measures of the supernatural and belief and religion are really just scratching the surface at some larger construct.
That's an interesting question. We need more work on hope in particular, so that's an area where I think there is an interest in. In fact, there's a Templeton initiative right now that's focusing on hope and optimism. But there's a religious effect over and above that, as best we've been able to tell. Religion is one source of hope and optimism. Religion is one source for a whole lot of different things that could be had from other places. Do you think, and I apologize if this image offends anybody, but religion as a social institution, the way we as sociologists would think about it, is a one-stop shop. You can go to this store, get this, that store, get that store, get that, and eventually you've got yourself a whole meal. It may even be a really good meal. You spent the whole day doing it, and it may not be as good a meal. In fact, the chances are it may not be as good a meal. It's probably the probability, not just a chance. What's remarkable about religion as a social institution is how many different functions it serves, how many different needs it serves for so many different people from so many different cultures, and so forth. Is it absolutely necessary? Oh, probably not. But there's a reason why it's hung around this long, and I suspect that's a big part of the explanation. And that's certainly part of the discussion of religion and mental health, is where are you going to, how are you going to cobble together all these different things that might conceivably get you to the place where, on average, many of these more religious people already are. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, John?
On the relationships between the congregation measures and mental health, I
Mhm.
was wondering, is there any relationship between like how comfortable you feel in the congregation, or is there any measures that can get at that, like you know,
Mhm.
how long you've been in a congregation, or how
Really
many
good.
friends you have there, and if that makes a difference?
Really good question. The only person who has good data on this is Neil Krauss. And his investigations to this point really I mean, particularly a comfortable question, I think. And maybe the National Congregation Study, or that the Congregational Life Study has similar kinds of questions. But the only person I know who can connect this to mental or physical health in this sort of way is Neil Krauss. I shouldn't say no one else has the items, but he's the only one who has those items in a survey that has health information on it as well, that I know of. And he's typically treated those as inputs to a broader process. So we'll have a large structural model in which things like congregational fit is the way that I think he would conceptualize that. How well do you fit with the congregation? How cohesive is the congregation? Those kinds of questions tend to be associated with more congregational support. You have more. That tends to be a driver of how many friends you have in the congregation, which in turn is a driver of how much social support you get in the congregation, which in turn is a driver of your mental health standing, things like that. In terms of their independent association with any mental health outcome, I can't think of anybody who's really looked at that. It'd be an interesting thing to do, though. His data actually are ICPSR 03255, actually, if you could download that. Only the first 2 waves are public. Yes, sir.
You mentioned prayer being one of the kind of like the expressions of religion, but has there been any research done on like religious texts as far as mental health is concerned? Kind of like
What about religious
the
texts?
association, like the Bible or the Quran or anything like that? As far as like reading it, meditating, and memorizing it, has that been any relationship between mental health?
Interesting question. There's actually a guy who I think he's was really interested in this a few years ago and wanted to fund people to actually study this, and it didn't quite happen for whatever reason. Frequency of Bible reading is one question that is sometimes asked, and it doesn't appear to have any direct association with the kinds of outcomes we've been studying. That's not exactly what I would call the last word on the topic, so I think more research would just be great. But nothing definitive that I'm aware of at this point. And another thing, though, is that when people actually treat that measure, they put it together with other devotional practices in a way that probably horribly confuses the whole thing. So you've got frequency of prayer, frequency of Bible reading, frequency of watching religious television, and listening to religious radio, and listening to religious music, and doing this, doing that. Then you have some measure of non-organizational religiousness. So the whatever there might be independently associated with frequency of Bible reading. And you should see, if you haven't already, you should see the distribution on the Bible reading variable. Nobody reads the Bible except, I'm sure people at Baylor read the Bible, but in the general public, the North General Social Survey, the news is not good. You look at Stephen Prothrow's book and his results from his religious literacy survey, and now you understand why. People don't know anything. So I think it's an area that's ripe for further investigation. As for anything more, like actually studying it or memorizing it, I don't think we know anything about the associations there. That's a really fresh area. Mm-hmm. Your hand was up before you.
You've given one answer already, which is get longitudinal data. But I guess my
let me see if I can remember that answer. I'm probably going to stick with that one.
You're talking about, for example, how spiritual struggles and such interact with negative mental health outcomes.
Yeah.
How how have sociologists or other social scientists been able to really dig down into whether this causes that, the first causes the second, or first, some third thing causes the other
Yep.
two?
It's a great
What are some
question.
techniques that you guys have been employing to get at those types
Well,
of
so
issues?
far we've been stuck with, we have some longitudinal data, like I have a
Yeah.
study that, but it's only 2 waves, using data that the Presbyterian Church USA collected, so it's a denominationally specific sample. It has reasonably good distribution on some of these things because they fight a lot, particularly about politics. No, I mean they do. There are some issues that at the denominational level have been issues of conflict. We were able to detect independent associations of congregational conflict, interpersonal struggles, as we're calling it, over and above a lot of other things, with changes in psychological distress over 2 waves. I think it was 18 months or 24 months, which is a kind of a conservative test. Doesn't allow for a whole long period of change. It may be enough, but not a tremendous period. A lot of sociological studies that use big nationwide databases, 3 years, 5 years, takes them that long to get running to collect wave 2. Neil Krause's work also longitudinal. He typically uses 3 years. His is confined almost exclusively to older adults, so there's that. But he's had 2 waves. He's now moving into some analyses of multiple waves because he actually has collected 4 waves. Only the first 2 are public, but he has papers already in print with 3 waves. He's now into wave 4. He's a busy guy. And so he's been able to establish some things that the rest of the field is very impressed by, but they're just starting to come out. So we're really talking about stuff that is sitting in my inbox for me to review, or Jeff's inbox for him to review, things like that. There are other ways to do this if we really want to get serious about assessing causality, which we probably should do, in fact not probably about it. There are econometric techniques like propensity score matching and other things that would deal with unmeasured heterogeneity and other factors like that. So we could see if in fact they're unmeasured variables that incline people to be more conflictual or less conflictual or different on some of these other measures. That would be a worthwhile endeavor. Sociologists of religion in general and psychologists of religion in general typically have not employed that. Economists have pioneered that. They use that quite a lot, but and occasionally it's been employed, but not in this area that I'm aware of. So, yes, sir.
Maybe I missed this. Is there a correlation between stress factors and, say, the diversity within socioeconomic, within communities, in relation to socioeconomic or racial diversity, versus more uniform identity?
I wouldn't say that it's exactly that way, because I don't have a good answer to that question as stated. It's kind of interesting. I know I published a study some years back that showed that religious homogeneity actually was inversely associated with suicide rates, which could be taken as a kind of macro level indicator of mental health, since depression is an important precursor to suicide. And that is, the greater the extent that 2 people could be picked at random from a given community, and this was metropolitan area was the level of analysis. 2 people could be picked at random from that metropolitan area, and they were more likely to be of the same faith. In that situation, you had lower levels of suicide, lower rates of suicide. It didn't please a lot of people because it's kind of the politically incorrect answer. More diversity is supposed to be good. I think in a lot of ways it is. It's, in terms of religious diversity, doesn't seem to be good for suicide rates. But in terms of stress levels, I haven't seen anything that speaks directly to the question that you ask. It's an interesting question, though. Sorry, that's the closest I can come up with to an answer that speaks to the religion and mental health. Yeah.
Well, we have to wind it up. I want to thank Dr. Ellison for speaking to us and coming here, and thank all of you for coming to listen and for sticking around for the questions. And thank you very much, and drive safely.